All right, so we will go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for joining us to celebrate Punks in Peoria, making a scene in the American Heartland. My name is Heather, and I'm the publicity manager at the University of Illinois Press, and I'm just going to go over some brief logistical information and introduce our guests before we get started. First of all, thank you so much to Jonathan, Dawson, and Mark for being here today. They're going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then we will have time for a 20-minute Q&A at the end. You can enter questions throughout the event by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can purchase books from the Lit on Fire Books bookshop page. There will be a link in the chat box. Jonathan Wright will also be at Lit on Fire on June 18th from 6 to 9 p.m., so if you're in Peoria, please stop by and say hello. I'll put the event in the chat box as well. We will also be recording the event and posting it on our YouTube channel afterwards. You'll receive an email from Zoom after the event that will have both a link to our YouTube channel and a link to the Lit on Fire bookshop page as well. And now I will just briefly introduce our guests. Jonathan Wright is a writer, editor, musician, and longtime veteran of the Peoria music scene. He has served as editor-in-chief at Peoria Magazine since 2006 and is highly involved in the local arts community. In the mid-90s, Wright ran a small record label and promoted shows, bringing national acts like Jesus Lizard, Tortoise, and Fugazi to Peoria. As a member of the psychedelic rock band Lark's Tongue, he co-founded the Bird Dialect label. He also DJs, vinyl only, under the name Juan Goblin, leveraging his collection of more than 8,000 vinyl records. Dawson Barrett is an associate professor of U.S. history at Del Mar College in Texas. He is the author of Teenage Rebels, Successful High School Activists from the Little Rock Nine to the Class of Tomorrow, and The Defiant, Protest Movements in Post-Liberal America. His writings on protest, teaching, youth, and punk rock have appeared in academic and popular publications, including American Studies, Teen Vogue, and Waging Nonviolence. Marc Alghini creates a weekly music segment on the Greg and Dan morning show on News Talk WMBD and occasionally fills in on the show as a host. Throughout the years, Marc shifted from radio and record companies, working at one of America's first commercial alternative stations, WFNX Boston, and programming at WEQX Albany, New York, and was a DJ at the legendary Chicago radio station WXRT. In 2013, he took on the task of becoming program director for WWCT in Peoria. He has worked at numerous record labels and where he was responsible for the North American marketing and promotion for numerous record labels such as Mute US, Network Records, and Astrowork Records. And now, without further ado, I will turn it over to our guests. Thanks again to everyone for being here today.
Thank you, Heather, very much for the introductions. And for hosting this event. I'm Marc Alghini. Thank you all for joining us today. A couple of things I want to go over. Of course, Heather mentioned the book signing at Lit on Fire this Friday at 6 o'clock. There's going to be a Punks in Peoria show on Saturday, June 26th at the Night Shop in Bloomington Normal. Saturday, July 17th, there'll be a book signing at Ragged Records in Davenport, Iowa. And Sunday, September 5th, there'll be a 14-band festival outside of Casa del Arte here in Peoria, starting at 12 noon and going till 9 o'clock at night. We'll go through everything again and remind you guys about that as the event today goes on. We're talking with the authors, Jonathan Wright and Dawson Barrett, about their new book, Punks in Peoria, Making a Scene in the American Heartland, that came out today. Dawson, what was the motivation behind writing this book?
Yeah, thanks everybody for being here. Thanks, Mark. I went to my first punk rock show when I was 13 in Peoria. It was actually a show that John put on, but we did not meet until many years later. But within a few years, I was hooked. I was playing in bands. I was putting on shows. But as an angry teenager, I thought I hated Peoria and I didn't think there was anything especially great about it. But then I moved to Portland and I was in touring bands and we toured all over the U.S. and all over Europe. And it dawned on me that, our best shows and our best experiences were in places like Rapid City and Fargo. They weren't in Chicago. They weren't in Seattle. that kind of reminded me that there must be something about Peoria. And I think it was that there wasn't much going on and people had to kind of create from scratch. And so the opportunity to kind of work on this book project came up, and I knew that I could not pull it off. So I contacted John and I twisted his arm, and now I've stolen 7 years of his life, but I'm really grateful. And here it is. That's kind of where I was coming from.
Reading the book, there's a lot of amazing stories from kind of the late 70s up until today. And I suggest it's a very easy read, which is great because you learn the kind of the history of what was happening. Why don't you guys kind of give a brief kind of the early roots, and we're going to kind of go through this book in different segments, but I want people to have an understanding of kind of the early punk pioneers here in Peoria and Central Illinois, because without those early pioneers, it might not have happened in the 80s and 90s the way it did. So I don't know who wants to take it, but just kind of give us a brief history of some of the things and the people that were in the city who were doing things that were against what mainstream Peoria was into.
Sure. Well, I wanted to start by just saying, we took the chapter 1 to kind of set a foundation for the Peoria music scene in general. So we start all the way back to in 1956 when Elvis Presley first hits Peoria, and rock and roll. Peoria had the first rock and roll dances, and so we kind of just laid that foundation a little bit. In the early 70s, there was a band called the Jets, which morphed into a band called the Jets with a Z, which was basically Peoria's first glam rock band, very influenced by Bowie. This is like around 74 or so. And they famously went to pick up a copy of his album Diamond Dogs, and they were playing Rebel Rebel out that very same night at a bar in Peoria. And Graham Walker, who was in that band, said this was Peoria's introduction to punk rock. That was a little prior to what we know of as punk rock. Peoria never really had any punk bands in the 70s. When the Ramones came out in 76, 77, none of that existed in Peoria. Occasionally there would be something on the radio, but that was about it. There was a guy named John Giannoli who went on to found Pansy Division out of San Francisco, pretty world famous band. He was a high school student at Richwoods High here in Peoria, and he started a fanzine. And he was one of the few people that was, into this kind of underground scene. So he was kind of a player back then, but again, there weren't really original punk bands until the mid 80s, and the Steppy Brothers came to town, and they came down from Chicago. They had a successful band as teenagers up there. Their father was a Caterpillar employee. So kind of that common story, transferred to Peoria. They came down, they saw there was really no kind of scene down here at all. So they started their own. And that first kind of wave of a punk scene started in like 83, 84 with 15 or 20 people.
Wow. Let's you mentioned fanzines, which is kind of a rare sight these days. So maybe for I don't want to say the younger generation, but a lot of people might not know what a fanzine was, and kind of the importance of what a fanzine did for not only music in a particular city, but around the world. I don't know who wants to address what a fanzine is.
Sure. Well, a fanzine is essentially a photocopied magazine that you make yourself. Maybe you go and watch the bands in your town, you interview them, and it was a way to cover music that wasn't being covered in the big music press at the time. And there actually is still a pretty big zine culture. I'm guessing they don't steal copies from Kinko's the way that we did, but it's still there. And, it's a way to get the word out. I mean, just like flyers, zines were the way to communicate before the internet.
And which kind of brings us to our next kind of subject, which is the DIY ethic and the pre-internet DIY ethic. And I think there's some similarities between pre-internet and post-internet. And I mentioned pre-internet because, you know, of fanzines. There was no radio really playing it. There was no streaming radio. So you couldn't listen from of a radio station in California that might be playing the music you like, which you can do today. I know I had friends who pen palled me from England who would send me copies of John Peel's show on cassette so I could hear what was happening in the UK. So talk about the DIY ethic, especially when it comes to punk rock and not only getting the word out, but doing, promoting, all the things that were involved before the internet. And then we can talk about the things that are kind of happening during the internet age.
Yeah, that really, that DIY punk culture really got started in the early 80s with the California and DC hardcore scenes. You had bands on the East Coast like Minor Threat, bands on the West Coast like Black Flag. They basically created their own network of small venues across the country. And there were little pockets of people who would, you know, a lot of teenagers, young people who would rent out halls, who would do everything from the ground up. They would create the flyers, they would tack them to telephone poles, they would, you know, rent the halls, they would get there early to break down chairs and tables and stay late to clean up and sweep the floors. You know, promotion was running off flyers at the at your Kinko's and dropping them off at record stores and coffee shops and that sort of thing. So that DIY culture really got started in the early 80s, and it kind of crept into Peoria when the Steppy Brothers moved down, and more and more people were getting into it, and it kind of, you know, it was a sort of a revolution all across the country.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can I add something there?
Sure.
I would just say that, you know, experiencing something that's DIY is just so radically different than what we're used to. You know, if you think music is going to like a big arena and seeing Aerosmith 1 inch tall on a giant stage, you know, thousands of feet from you, you know, you take away one thing. But if you have to go and help fold up the chairs and the tables at the Legion Hall like we did, and then you watch your favorite band 2 feet from you, and then they watch your band play right afterward, you know, it's a completely different relationship to how culture works. And I think that really is important.
Do you feel as though being part of that kind of DIY ethic helped you become the person you are today?
No doubt about it. Absolutely. I mean, one of the biggest moments of my life was when Fugazi played here in 1995. I put that show together, and I had such huge respect for them. They were a DC post-punk band that were renowned for playing $5 shows, for playing off the beaten path venues, and just for their DIY instincts, and they lived up to all of my expectations and surpassed them. And just that whole experience really had a huge impact on me in terms of my growth as a person, and my politics, and how I viewed myself and in relation to the world.
Yeah,
go
ahead.
Go ahead.
I'd say, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the ideals of DIY and, you know, the empowerment and feeling like you can do something. But I would also say that there are specific skills that you learn without kind of knowing it. So when I got out of playing in bands, I got really heavily into organizing protests. This was kind of as the war in Iraq was exploding. And it turns out it's the same skills. You know, you make flyers, you talk to people, you get people into a space, you do things that are slightly illegal. You know, I mean, I think that there are these skills that you develop as a teenager, and I have continued to use them in lots of walks of my life.
I'm going to agree with you guys. I think, you know, being part of a DIY scene and ethic taught me that you could do anything, no matter what hurdle there was in front of you. For some reason, the punks kind of knocked down that hurdle to get the show on, or to get a band from one city to the next. on $25 and a couple pizzas. I mean, the bands, I mean, I recall talking with Mike Watt, who's from the Minutemen and Fire Hose, and his number one thing was the Econoline, you know, the Econoline van, Jam Econo. And, you know, he was one of those California guys, early punks, who was about that DIY ethic. And you know, he could do anything, and he did anything and everything. What about in the post-internet? How does punk today survive in the post-internet? When you guys were writing this book, what did you discover that was different from back when you guys were doing shows in the 80s and 90s?
It's just a completely different landscape. You know, the same things are happening, but in totally different ways. People aren't necessarily printing off stacks of flyers and handing them out physically, but now you have your band camps and social media and TikTok and different things that allow you to get your message out. And you know, I think there's positives and negatives about both. But you know, I'd say probably 90% of the book itself takes place in the pre-internet era, and for a variety of reasons. But I would say, you know, absolutely all of this is still happening in a different form. You know, we're a little bit older now and maybe a little less engaged in that youth culture. So I don't know that I could speak with authority to what everyone is doing today. But certainly we wanted to make sure that while the book is about history and it's about the past, we wanted to make sure that we did not come off like the old men who are, you know, everything was great back when we were kids and, you know, the golden age and everything. We really wanted to avoid that. I hope that we did. There's nothing wrong with celebrating the past and looking back to it, but I think all of us really want to be right here in the moment.
Sure, and looking forward to the future, and hoping that the generations to come will keep the DIY ethic and the punk ethic alive. Let's go back to like early Peoria, and the scene is now, people are now doing punk shows. They're gathering at record stores, sharing flyers, talking about records that they've discovered. And there's all these different high schools. And I was sent for 2 years to a all-boys private high school. And I quickly learned that I got other different cultures in. And what my friends were listening to in my hometown was very different from what the friends I met in high school were listening to from the south side of Chicago, who were being bussed up to this private school. Were high schools like that even here in Central Illinois? Were there different scenes happening? Was ska big at one school and hardcore at another, or were bands? Help me out, guys. Like, you know what I'm kind of trying to say? Were there specific bands that were coming out of different high schools and different sounds?
Well, there were definitely bands coming out of different high schools. I think probably, at least kind of when I was in high school, it was closer to reality that each high school had like 2 or 3 ska kids and 2 or 3 hardcore kids and 2 or 3, you know, gutter punk kids. And then they all had to find each other from the other high schools. You know, we say it's punks in Peoria, but it's really Peoria plus, you know, 24 small towns and farming communities, you know, East Peoria, Morton, Dunlap, places like that.
Okay.
Yeah, I would add to that too, something interesting anecdote in the book. Bob Harrington, who owned Co-op Records on Main Street in Peoria, was kind of talking about the people who would come into Co-op, and this is like 86, 87, and people dressed like the subculture that they were a part of. So there were, you know, people with the spandex black leather pants that were into the hair metal scene. There was the corn chips, which is the uniquely Peorian term, but into kind of that, you know, pretty in pink, the new wave and different things like that. You know, you had your metalheads, and but the thing with Peoria was that they all came together, because there wasn't enough in any one subgroup to sustain its own scene. So that's another common theme of the book, was how eclectic the Peoria music scene was, and how you would have, a folk musician playing next to a death metal band, and everybody, not that everyone always got along like one big happy family, but that eclectic mix kept coming up over and over again as we talked to people in terms of, what they remembered and what they appreciated about those days.
Yeah, you mentioned the word corn chip, and that was not a term I heard in Chicago or Boston at all. So, and I read about it in the book. Explain to some people who might not be from Central Illinois what a corn chip was.
Well, it was the term was coined in the East Peoria High School cafeteria in 1985. And basically it was just kind of a catch-all phrase for anyone who was kind of different, out of the mainstream, didn't listen to the top 40 radio hits. Maybe they felt a little out of place at the high school. A lot of those people all connected together. Some of them connected in the punk scene. So the corn chips were, there was an overlap with the punk scene, but it was also kind of adjacent to the punk scene. And at the same time, there were these teen dance clubs that were coming up in Peoria, Stage 2, and later it became Sneakers, and several others. And this was a huge thing. They would have, nights where they would have teenage nights where they served soda and people would get together. And this was a huge thing for different people from the various high schools to kind of find their own. So they would, go out and do that. And so the phrase corn chip somehow developed a life of its own. It's just one of those really strange oddities. As far as we can tell, it did go up to the Quad Cities, and it was used quite extensively there. But that's really, there's a few scattered references elsewhere, but that's really where it ended. So if you're not from Peoria or the Quad Cities, you probably have never even heard that phrase. But yet on Facebook, there's 2 groups dedicated to it. So it was a really interesting kind of side venture that as we were working through the book.
Was it used as like a derogatory term from like the jocks to the arty kids or the goth kids, or was it sort of like kind of self-deprecating amongst the punks and the goth kids and the outsiders?
Right. It was both. It started out as an insult, and then, in many cases like this, it was reclaimed by the object of that derision, and then kind of worn as a badge of honor eventually. So.
Okay, let's talk about those teen dance clubs. And this, you mentioned that this was the gathering point in the 80s and 90s for high school kids to kind of come together from the different high schools. Was it kind of like segregated where the goth kids were on one side and the punk kids were on another side and the new wave kids on another side, or were they just kind of mingling all together?
It was both. I was able to go to a couple of those in the early 90s. I wasn't there in the 80s, but from all of the accounts that we talked to, there were people from all of those groups who came, and oftentimes there were these little, kind of little cliques that would set up, in this giant space. And so you'd have the metalheads over here and the new wave kids over there, and et cetera, et cetera. But I think also it was important to note that they were all under the same roof. So it was an eclectic mix of people, I'd say.
In any of your stories, was there a particular song that kind of everybody got on the dance floor together and went crazy for, like Duran Duran or?
I don't know. I couldn't speak to that necessarily.
What about in the 90s when you went there? There had to be that time. When everybody just kind of said, yeah, this is the song, and nobody kind of hated it, or that story never kind of came up?
There wasn't a particular song that came up in these accounts, but I think, there was a crossover with the dance music that was coming out of Chicago. This was like the birth of house music. in the mid 80s, and a lot of the same people who were going to the dance clubs in Peoria would go up to Chicago on the weekends and go to Medusa's and check out these, house music. And so, I think there was that, but it was really, it was a mix. There was a lot of, popular music mixed in with some of the more obscure dance music and different things like that.
Okay. Now, we were talking about different groups and stuff like that, and I think this happened all across America at the time. Was a lot of the punk scenes started getting infiltrated by kind of these neo-Nazi punks that were kind of coming into these shows and trying to kind of take over and preach things that a lot of people didn't agree with, including the bands. Was that prevalent here in Peoria as well?
Dawson, you want to take that?
Well, I mean, we talk about it at several points. It comes up. It doesn't appear in retrospect to be especially well organized. And as John has said elsewhere, we kind of use the term Nazi punks. And I think some of these people, did have swastikas on their jackets. Other people were just being jerks and were just kind of lumped in as sort of like meatheads. But, one of our conclusions is that, nationwide, not just in Peoria, but there's a reason that neo-Nazis were drawn to punk rock, because to them, it seemed like an angry, white, male-dominated space that was sort of ripe for something, whether, infiltration or conversion or something to that effect. And I think that has to be noted.
We had problems. So I put on shows from 94 to 97 here in Peoria, and we had sporadic problems all throughout that time period where different troublemakers would show up. And we didn't have official security. My friends and I were the security. So we would have to figure out a way to, get them to behave or to kick them out, to forcibly remove them. And so I actually was, I was in multiple fist fights because of that. None that I started, but, you just get into something, and, I had to take responsibility for the show and for everyone's safety. So, at the Fugazi shows, several of my friends and I were escorting people out the door. And I ended up getting punched in the face. I lost a contact lens. I had my jeans ripped open. That's where I ended up at the end of the show. So there were definitely problematic individuals all throughout. But I'm happy to say that there was a much stronger presence of the opposite force. And so me and my friends and others were very, very conscious about not allowing them any sort of entree into our space.
All right. That seems as though you guys handled it the same way the rest of America kind of handled it. And we'll continue talking more about shows in just a bit. We're talking with Jonathan Wright and Dawson Barrett, the authors of Punks in Peoria, Making a Scene in the American Heartland. It came out today. This Friday at Lit on Fire on Main Street in Peoria from 6 until 9. Jonathan will be there signing copies of the book. On Saturday, June 26th, there'll be a show and book signing at Night Shop in Bloomington Normal. Super 88, Terribly Happy, Steve and Jared Grab. There's a Facebook page for it. Saturday, July 17th, out in Davenport, Iowa, there'll be a book signing at Ragged Records from 9 until noon. And that's at the new location of Ragged in Davenport. And then Sunday, the big 14-band festival outside of Casa del Arte, noon to 9 here in Peoria. 14 bands from noon until 9. My name's Marc Alghini, and I'm kind of having a conversation with Jonathan and Dawson. Let's talk about some of these venues, because I want to get to questions from the audience here. Time is going by very quickly. Let's talk about some of those early venues, the VFW Hall, the Owen Center, and then we'll move into like the 90s venues. So the Owen Center and VFW Hall in Creve Coeur, there were some pretty intense shows at those places. Jonathan, Dawson, you want to talk about some of those?
Yeah, well, we had the infamous Gigi Allen show took place in Creve Coeur. I'm not going to get too into that, the details of that, but you can look it up and find out what happened.
You go into detail in the book, which is great. It's a
Yeah,
great story.
We do. It is a pretty intense story. About a month after that show, some of the local punks, the Steppy brothers and some of their friends rented out a hall at, or rented out a room at the Owen Center. So this is, an indoor ice skating rink. And there was a side room, and they just rented this space out, and they did shows there for, I think, 7 or 8 months, off and on, maybe one a month or every other month. So, and that eventually came to an end due to the kind of natural conflict between the hockey fans and the loud teenagers in the room next door. And so there was, there are all kinds of, I think that's one of the running themes of the book, is the unique venues, the unique spaces that were repurposed and turned into punk rock clubs. There was a place in the Heights called the Juice Bar that was a dry bar. They served juice, and that was the place to do shows for the summer of 1987. There was an ICC student who found out he could rent the gymnasium over in East Peoria, and he did that and put on some pretty big shows there. So none of these spaces were designed for small, intimate punk rock shows, but they were turned into that by the kind of sheer willpower of the promoters.
All right. And then, of course, you did the Fugazi show at Expo Gardens. How did that kind of come about? Did you reach out to them, or did they reach out to you guys? Because that's in the punk rock world, that's the big get. That's like getting the Rolling Stones to play your venue.
Yeah, I was thrilled. Ever since I started doing shows, they were the #1 band I was hoping to get to Peoria. And once I realized that, hey, I actually could contact some of these bands and they actually will come here and play, that was kind of a revelation to me. So then I just started, shooting for the sky. And I don't remember exactly how it happened, if it was a phone call or a letter, I did have a very early version of email back in 1996 in my dorm room, so it could have even been that. But certainly I reached out to their booking agent, and with Fugazi, they were always looking to play unique spaces. And so I think Peoria, Illinois, a small town, young promoter, I think it intrigued them. So.
Right on. And then we let's go to the 90s. I was intrigued by a venue called the Airwaves Skate Park, and that was on Washington Street. How did that come about? Talk about some of the shows that were there. It seems as though that was the place back in the 90s.
Dawson, you want to take that one?
Yeah, well, I mean, you have to talk about sort of this Nirvana explosion in the early 90s. If you read Maximum Rock and Roll, they actually did a spread on Nirvana right before Nevermind came out. And then after it came out, they were like, they've ruined punk. We hate them. And I feel that from the underground. But, for me personally, bands like Nirvana and Green Day got me into underground music. And that clearly happened in Peoria, where hundreds of people started going to Airwaves, and all these quirky, interesting, and kind of awesome bands from 91 to 94 came out of Peoria, of all places.
When I first started working at Co-op Records in 1994, all I heard about was how great Airwaves used to be. And it was just slightly before my time. I never actually went there myself, but I heard so much about it. It was kind of viewed as this like Shangri-La, this mythical, like perfect utopia in hindsight. Of a space. And it wasn't until we started working on this book and I dug into it and tried to create a timeline of the shows that went on there. And it was only about 10 months that there were shows there. I believe there were maybe 14 or 15 shows. That's it. But when you're young, time seems so much different. That seemed like such a longer time period. So that was another kind of interesting finding, I guess. And yeah, like Dawson said, we were not cognizant of, we knew that the Nirvana thing was happening, but no one was trying to emulate it directly. But when you look back in hindsight, you can kind of see the patterns. You can see these things happening all across the country, and in Peoria, it was happening at Airwaves, and there was a band called Dollface that was the biggest band in the scene, and they were on an actual record label. They put out a CD. This was before CDs were ubiquitous, and you could just burn your own copies. That was a big deal. They toured. They played South by Southwest. All of us looked up to them. We all thought they were going to be, the next Nirvana. They didn't, spoiler alert, they didn't turn out to be the next Nirvana, but their music, which we heard at the top of this session, their music has lived on. In fact, we reissued their albums on vinyl back in 2014 on a label that I put together. They created a timeless music, amazing songwriters, and so even though they didn't become the next Nirvana, they left a legacy that I think people will still be discovering years from now.
Any other bands outside of Dollface that kind of like made that scene happen in the 90s? And I definitely want to get to the fact that Jonathan, you were doing shows at the American Legion Hall right up the street from the Madison Theater. And so I want to talk about that as well. But any other bands we should know about that were from that kind of 90s glory days of punk in Peoria?
Yeah, well, I'll say this so that John doesn't have to brag, but his record label put out a compilation CD at that time. So it was bands like Nora Haight and Dismiss, really, really great bands. I mean, I don't know how many, 7, 8, 10 bands it seemed like, but I know lots of people who picked up that CD and just listened to it over and over again. And some bands were better than others, but I still get songs from that compilation in my head. And that was 1985.
Jonathan, can we get that on the streaming networks or?
Yeah, in fact, our friend Brody Mag just uploaded a digital version to Bandcamp, so that's actually available now.
Okay.
It is out there.
Right on. Jonathan, let's talk about some stories that you had at the American Legion Hall, and then we're going to take some questions from the audience. You were promoting shows in the 90s. This is post Airwaves, post shows at the Madison Theater, the American Legion Hall. You were and the Fugazi show we've already talked about. What was special about the American Legion Hall?
Well, and I did do a few shows at the Madison Theater. Those were kind of running concurrently with the hall shows, but there was a hall on Monroe Street, a couple blocks away, that was kind of I did my first show there, and that was kind of my home for shows for the first probably year and a half that I was doing shows there. One of the big stories that I recall was when the Jesus Lizard played in Peoria. They were it was a warm-up gig for their stint on the Lollapalooza tour that year. So they were literally moving from Peoria to go onto the Lollapalooza tour. And it was an amazing evening. In fact, that was the show that Dawson was talking about. That was his very first punk rock show. But I was so excited to have them, and my friends and I were so happy and just couldn't believe that this band that we loved, that we idolized, was on stage here in Peoria, talking to the war vets in the bar next door. But what I'll never forget about that is after the show, it went off successfully. We did have a little bit of disturbance from the usual troublemakers, but after the show, I got approached by a guy who started asking me questions, and it was obvious he was, with some sort of journalist, or I assumed he was with a small fanzine, that sort of thing. And then after we were done talking, I asked him who he was writing for, and he said Rolling Stone, and I was like, wait, Rolling Stone, the Rolling Stone, like the national magazine Rolling Stone. And sure enough, it was. And I actually have become friends with the guy decades later. Have become friends with the guy that approached me. But about a month after that, there was a big cover story in Rolling Stone on the Jesus Lizard. And at the time they were like, well, maybe they're the next Nirvana. Maybe they are going to be the ones to make it big. And again, there never was a next Nirvana. That never happened.
It's like there's never been a next Bob Dylan.
Exactly.
Let's briefly touch, and I want to talk about women and diversity in the scene before we start taking some questions, because punk rock, pretty much everywhere in America, was white male dominated. But there were women, unfortunately, in the background in a lot of cities. What was women's roles in the punk scene that you guys discovered while you were writing this book?
Yeah, I would say that in Peoria, anyway, women were a constant presence in the scene. They were in bands, they were putting on shows, they were friends of the bands, et cetera, et cetera. I definitely would say they were outnumbered. And I think it is fair to say that as much as punks wanted to be a counterculture, often the scene kind of just recreated a lot of the sexism, some of the racism and homophobia of sort of this broader American culture that they were supposed to be rebelling against. So, I mean, I think that's a fair critique. I would also say that for me personally, you know, I came into punk rock as a 13-year-old and I brought all this baggage, all these bad ideas, stereotypes, prejudices, probably some bigotries. But being around people who were challenging those ideas, you know, gave me the space to do that. Obviously, not everyone decided to, but I think that is what punk rock is. It's not a counterculture, but it's a slightly more flexible, navigable space for young people.
Dawson, I'm glad you kind of said that, because today I was thinking about it, and that's the same kind of way I went through it. 13, I was very different when I was 17, from learning a lot, and especially the women in punk rock when I was a kid helped me realize things, a way to look at things that were different than what, you know, we were kind of brought up as back in the early 80s. Let's turn it to Heather. We're talking with Jonathan Wright and Dawson Barrett, punks in Peoria, making a scene in the American Heartland. We definitely want to hear from the people. And hopefully Heather's got some questions lined up for us.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you guys so much. This has been a really fascinating conversation. So our first question comes from Michael Rue, and he wants to know, what was your awareness of scenes in Bloomington Normal, Springfield, and Urbana-Champaign? And did you compete or collaborate with those scenes?
We were all aware, I think, of what was happening in Bloomington Normal and Champaign, at least to a point. And, you know, you're pretty focused on your own scene, but you know, there were no venues in Peoria, so we would drive to Bloomington and go to the Gallery. We would drive to Champaign and go to the Blind Pig. We would go to Mabel's. That's where the bands would come to, unless we were lucky enough to get them for a hall show in Peoria. So there was always these interconnected threads. The Steppy Brothers at the beginning, they had a whole crew of skateboarders in Springfield that they hung out with and connected with, because again, you know, when you're in this sort of obscure community, you have to look outward to you know, find your own. So I think there was always that connection. It's interesting to note that Champaign and Bloomington both had bigger scenes than Peoria, even though they were smaller cities. And we attribute that a lot due to the college town atmosphere of Bloomington and Champaign, where you had continual turnover of young people and youth happening there. And they had radio stations that were playing, you know, independent underground music. There were actual venues that you could play at. So Bloomington and Champaign were huge, and they were, you know, it was so huge that we decided to dedicate an entire chapter to Bloomington Normal and Champaign Urbana to a lesser extent, but because it was really a part of the Peoria story, no doubt about it.
And building off on that, Jessica Stevenson wants to know if you ever played with braid or cursive.
I'll take braid. Didn't play with them, but I did book them in Peoria. They played a basement at 808 University in 1996, and that was a great show. Super fun.
No, I did not play with cursive. They played at the Morton Optimist Club. I did see them at a house in Bloomington once. They came through several times.
Nice. Okay, so our next question comes from Joe Austin, and he asks, he says, I was impressed with Dawson's distinction between arena rock and most local punk shows. What do you think that more immediate or up-close aesthetic came about, and what do you think it fulfilled?
Well, I'd like to say that it's, because of this like stripped down punk rock thing, but I'm guessing realistically it's that punks could only afford a small space and crammed as many people as they could into them. But I think that intimacy is really important. As I mentioned earlier, I mean, you can't really put into words how important it is to see your favorite band 2 feet away and, get their sweat on you or whatever. I think that's something you remember forever.
Okay, so our next question comes from Dylan Tomlins, and he says, I can't wait to read the book. Do you think there are any lessons to be learned for modern day corn chips?
In the conclusion of the book, we try to kind of wrap things up with like a holistic view of the past, but also looking toward the future. We don't necessarily have any answers, but I think that we definitely found a lot of inspiration in the DIY subculture that came out of this. And, doing it yourself often meant it means more. It means more when you do something yourself. And so that kind of independent mentality and I don't know. I think that, I mean, it's had influences in so many ways of my own life, and I know Dawson's as well. Yeah.
I want to step in here and talk about how, like, the future of courtship. The thing you have to remember is, the early generation punks, their grandparents listened to like Perry Como. The new generation kids who are arty and gothic or whatever they're into, your grandparents listened to REM and they listened to punk rock. They listened to Minor Threat and stuff like that. So I think you're going to see it a little bit easier to grow up knowing that, grandparents and parents are part of the modern age of punk, where back in the 80s, that wasn't the case.
Okay, but look at who those grandparents are voting for. All right.
Yeah. Well, see, but then, all right, I got you.
So Dylan actually has another question, and he wants to know what research methods were the most fruitful in writing the book. Did you have to rely on oral history, or were there any surviving fanzines or other artifacts from the era?
I think the most fruitful is your direct interview. Obviously, even though we're talking to people about events that took place maybe 30 years ago, sometimes more, you have to kind of take everything with a grain of salt and try to get multiple people to get their thoughts on what happened so that you can kind of put together, here's what we think probably happened. We interviewed more than 80 people in depth. In addition to distributing a public survey online that was available for months, and I think 50 to 75 people took that survey and gave us a lot of different leads and stories and some quotes that we used for the book. Certainly, my friends at the Peoria Public Library were very helpful in tracking down certain newspaper articles and some of the research in that first chapter where we're kind of setting the stage for punk rock, and we're digging back into the 50s and 60s and 70s where there's even less documentation. so I think, and there were fanzines. We had people who dug them up out of their basements and gave them to us, and you know, we quote from them in the book. You know, we try to use as many firsthand sources as possible in that sense. And then, you know, we also found random accounts online, you know, with the right keyword searches that led us, you know, to other places as well. So it was really an amalgamation of all different types of sources. And you know, but let me tell you, to transcribe 80 interviews takes a long time. That's why this whole project took, you know, around 7 years to complete, off and on.
But John, it means that much more because it was
means
DIY.
that much more. Yeah, I did all that myself.
All right, so our next question comes from Tom Alter, and he wants to know, did the 94-95 UAW strike against CAT have much of an impact on the Peoria scene? Did it change young people's view of organized labor or not?
I don't think that we found, I mean, I expected it to be bigger than it was. I don't think we really found any references to it. Definitely what was happening in Peoria in terms of like this, you know, kind of 30-year trend of deindustrialization and population decline. You know, punk rock fits in there in Peoria. You know, a lot of those venues that we talked about were the venues of a previous generation that had, you know, not reproduced itself as a Peoria middle class. But I don't think I saw anything on labor. Did you, John?
Not really. I mean, I think we were all aware that it was happening, but it just seemed like, you know, that's just what was happening. I don't think any of us saw it in perspective of being of these larger societal shifts. I think really, you know, a lot of that you can see it in hindsight, but when you're living through it, you don't see it quite as much. So yes, there were, you know, sons and daughters of Caterpillar employees who were a part of this book, and it certainly had an impact. And of course, you know, the whole reason the Steppe brothers moved down to Peoria in the first place was because of Caterpillar. So there are these, their father had a job there. So there are these, you know, these trends and kind of common themes that you can kind of suss out when you put it all together and look at it from this like complex tapestry of different people's perspectives. But, you know, speaking for myself, I was aware of it, but it didn't have any impact on me when I was, you know, in that scene that I knew of. So, yeah.
All right, so we have another question from Jessica Stevenson. And for those of you who don't know, Jessica is the owner of Lit on Fire Books. So again, there is a link to their bookshop page in the chat box. So please support indie bookstores and purchase the book from them. So she wants to know if you would tell us what bands you each played in, what instruments you played, and what your favorite venue was in the area.
Yeah, I played drums in a band called Laura's Agent. And then I was in a band out of Portland, Oregon called Dead Like Dallas. I don't know if I had a favorite. I mean, the Morton Optimist Club, Tiamat Records, Pizza Works was a lot of great shows there. I guess, I mean, at the time, you sort of tried to book your favorite, and if they weren't available, you moved on to your second or your third. But I mean, I think I don't have a favorite venue. I'm sorry.
Back when I got into the scene in the 90s, I was working at Co-op. I started promoting shows. I started a record label. I met a lot of my friends who were all in bands. I was not in a band. I did have some kind of a spoken word poetry side project thing about that time, which I cringe at today. But I was kind of more of the logistical organizer. At that time. It wasn't until years later, 2010 actually, that I actually joined a band and started playing keyboards for Lark's Tongue. And I had done that for the last 10 years or so. And as far as venues go, yeah, you know, I appreciated all of them for what they were. I would say just for myself. Some of the shows at Tiamat Records were really, really incredible. And then I have a soft spot for the Legion Hall downtown, which sadly no longer exists. That was where I started doing shows. So, and the Madison Theater was fun as well.
So Diane Pierce wants to know if any of you remember playing at Airwaves.
Before my time.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about that. Airwaves lasted about slightly less than a year, and it was just before I started working at Co-op, just before I came up in that scene. So it had kind of gone by the wayside at that point.
So I think we have time for one more question, and it's actually for me. I'm curious if you guys could talk a little bit about what the process of putting the album together was like. How did you choose what songs? Because I imagine that was really hard.
Yeah, it was very, very challenging. No one record could tell that whole story. That was impossible. When I initially conceived of the idea of having a companion album, we talked about it as maybe a double LP. Let's shoot for the stars. And I contacted Alona's Dream Records, and they reissue a lot of local Peoria area recordings, and have done a fantastic job as an independent label. And I knew that the owner had been involved in fact, at the Airwaves scene back in the day. And so he was very interested. We talked, and you know, I think this project was very unique to have a book companion to the record. So we quickly realized that a double LP was going to be way too expensive, and there's no way that we were going to be able to do that. So obviously you have a limited amount of space on either side. We were trying to tell a story musically that would mesh with the book. We wanted to include some of those really, really early punk bands that had never had their albums on vinyl. We decided against, some of the biggest bands from our scene are not included on the record, and that was by choice. So Planes Mistaken for Stars and The Forecast, for example, Scouts Honor, those bands were not included because most of their discography was already in print on vinyl. So we wanted to dig back a little bit further and kind of rescue some of those unreleased gems from the 80s and 90s. And so it was a mix of, musical genre and obscurity, and trying to tell that story. I'm happy with where we landed. I will say that there were certainly some bands that I wish we could have included on there. And of course, people can critique the particular selections that we ended up deciding. But I think overall it's a really good picture of kind of that musical progression from very, very simplistic hardcore skate punk to the late 90s, when you get a really like an explosion of different varieties of subgenres.
Yeah, I would add, I think it's wonderful. And I think it's also helpful that so many of the early songs are like 45 seconds long, so we could include more of them.
Right.
Thanks. And so we do have that linked in the chat for anyone who is interested. Please check it out from Alona's Dream Records. So it looks like we are just about out of time. Before I turn it over to you guys for any final comments, I just wanted to thank you all again for being here today. If anyone is interested, please purchase a book from Lit on Fire. A link to their bookshop page is in the chat. You can follow Punks in Peoria on social media. I think it's just at Punks in Peoria on everything, right? Yep. Yeah. So yeah, thank you all so much. Do you all have any final words for us?
I would say that we're really grateful to all of the people who allowed us into their lives to poke around at their teenage selves 30 years later. We were grateful that people kind of trusted us to tell that story. And I would just put in a plug for the festival coming up here in September. It's going to be a really good time. The tickets are on sale now. And today is actually the last day for the early bird discount. So go check it out.
Perfect. Thanks, John. Thanks, Heather. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, everybody
Yeah,
else.
thank you guys.
Yeah. Thanks everybody for tuning in.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.